The A Shau Valley had been reduced to a colossal sponge, saturated past the point of endurance. For 6 days, Team Ghost, Sergeant Rooker, Specialist Vargas, and Private First Class Delaney had occupied the Hog's Tooth, a poorly sandbagged listening post overlooking a stretch of river known only for swallowing light. The defining feature of their existence was the rain, a thick, silver sheet that fell with the monotony of a broken clock, muffling the world until the only sound remaining was the drumming on their helmets and the slow, agonizing pump of their own hearts. Rooker, a man whose features had been permanently molded by humidity and cynicism, watched the perimeter through rain-streaked binoculars. They were deep within VC territory, tasked only with listening and reporting, not engaging. That directive had been hammered home. Silence was survival. The wait was worse than any charge. It eroded the nerves, turning every shadow into an enemy scout and every fatigue-induced twitch into a threat. Vargas, hunched over the PRC-77, constantly wiped moisture from the seals, his eyes reflecting the green static of the radio display, their only umbilical cord to sanity. Delaney, or Flick as the squad called him due to his obsessive need to fiddle with things, was the newest and most strained. He wrestled with an almost debilitating need for a cigarette, a small, foolish ritual of defiance against the endless dread. His Zippo, heavy brass, felt like an anchor in his pocket, a forbidden promise. 6 days of forced stillness had boiled down the world to this small, muddy hole, and the tension was so thick it seemed to repel the rainwater. The physical misery was a character in itself. Trench foot was not an abstract medical condition. It was the raw, constant agony in Delaney's soles, swollen and white, the flesh threatening to slough off. Everything smelled of rot, moldy canvas, stale sweat, decomposing jungle flora, and the metallic tang of fear. Sleep was achieved in desperate, 90-minute intervals, always disturbed by the chilling sensation of water seeping into the lowest point of the bunker floor. Rooker maintained his rigid schedule, believing that discipline was the last bastion against the jungle's madness. He forced Delaney to recite the withdrawal protocols every hour, ensuring the new guy's mind remained engaged, though his body was deteriorating. Vargas, the medic, monitored their diminishing rations and their morale with clinical detachment. He knew their physical degradation was accelerating their mental unraveling. The constant white noise of the rain was both a shield and a torment. It hid their sound but magnified the silence between the drops. Delaney pressed his back against the damp earth, feeling the cold leach into his spine. He hallucinated the taste of dry coffee. He kept running scenarios in his head. What if he just lit one, quickly cupping the flame? The constant, internal negotiation between self-control and mounting psychological stress became louder than the monsoon itself. He reached into his pocket just to touch the lighter, a small act of rebellion that offered momentary comfort. Rooker had spent the last 2 hours observing a specific patch of secondary growth about 50 meters below their position, the Ghost Trail. It wasn't an obvious path. It was a subtle deviation in the mud and moss, invisible to the untrained eye, showing the passage of weight that wasn't random animal movement. He focused the binoculars until his eyes watered, looking for the telltale sign of displaced earth or a broken sapling that hadn't been snapped by wind. Then he saw it, a tiny, freshly turned print where a boot heel had slipped in the mud. Not hours old, minutes. The NVA were not just moving along the river. They were hugging the higher ground, perhaps seeking the same shelter. Rooker signaled Vargas with a slow, deliberate tightening of his fist, contact imminent. Vargas immediately checked the radio security protocols, lowering the squelch until only the most necessary transmissions could be heard. The realization hit them simultaneously and physically. They were not watching the enemy. They were cohabitating with them. They were separated by maybe 50 yards of incredibly dense jungle, breathing the same wet air, listening to the same relentless downpour. The weight, which had been passive, instantly turned active and malignant. Every single drop of rain felt like a spotlight on their position. Rooker subtly shifted his M16, easing the safety off with microscopic care, the soft click swallowed by the storm. He stared at Delaney, his eyes communicating an ancient command. Breathe shallowly. Move nothing. The weight of time began to distort. The 2 minutes Rooker spent watching the trail after spotting the boot prints stretched into an eternity defined only by the rhythmic splash of water dripping from the bunker's bamboo roof. Delaney, following Rooker's silent command, felt his muscles seize. He couldn't shake the sensation that the humidity was pressing in on his lungs, restricting his air. He became hyper-aware of his own body, the ragged breath, the loud, insistent thumping of his heart against his ribcage. He knew, intellectually, that the rain masked their sounds, but paranoia whispered that the NVA had superhuman hearing, honed by years in the tunnels. The urge to distract himself was overwhelming. It was a compulsion born of fear and extreme fatigue. He thought of his Zippo again, the cheap, reliable mechanism. He had promised himself just one quick, deep drag, inhaled entirely within the shelter of his poncho, covered by the sound of the next thunderclap. He slowly, painstakingly, slid his hand into his breast pocket. The metal was cold against his fingertips. He felt the engraved initials, FJD. The familiar feel of the tool was grounding. He imagined the flame, brief and warm, a tiny sun in the endless gray gloom. He calculated the risk. Thunder was rolling in the distance, a deep, heavy roar that would cover the faint shing of the lid opening and the click of the wheel. He committed. The air hung thick and pregnant. The distant thunder had promised a massive release, a crashing sound that would shake the valley, but the storm front stalled, creating a pocket of terrifying, momentary silence. The rain continued, but only as a low, consistent drizzle, lacking the volume of the downpour moments before. Delaney's mind, focused only on the immediate need for a smoke, didn't register the change in atmospheric pressure. His fingers, numb and clumsy from the cold, fumbled with the Zippo. He had it halfway out of his pocket, thumb already resting on the lid, ready to execute the practiced motion. As he prepared to open it, his elbow knocked against the damp, rotting sandbag. The heavy, brass-cased Zippo slipped from his grasp. It fell perhaps 6 inches, hitting the lip of the M60 ammunition Rooker used as a seat. It wasn't a loud sound in the normal world, but in the absolute, rain-sodden stillness of a listening post, the impact was catastrophic. Clink! The sound was sharp, metallic, definitive. It cut through the ambient rain noise like a scalpel. Rooker froze mid-breath. Vargas's eyes snapped open, wide and disbelieving. For a full 3 seconds, nothing happened, just the sound's echo dissipating into the jungle humidity. Then, from the trees directly below them, 50 yards out, came the undeniable reply. A harsh, muffled shout in rapid Vietnamese, followed by the distinctive, sickening sound of an AK-47 safety being shoved off. The 7 days of agonizing, suffocating waiting were shattered by a quarter second of dropped brass. The silence following the Vietnamese shout was even more terrifying than the clink of the lighter. It was the silence of intent, the pause before the lethal action. Rooker, a machine honed by instinct, didn't hesitate. Before the enemy could confirm the target, Rooker roared, "Grenades! Contact high!" He didn't waste a second screaming at Delaney. The time for recriminations was over. Rooker snatched 2 fragmentation grenades, pulled the pins, counted 1,000, and lobbed them over the lip of the bunker toward the sound. The first thump of an incoming Chicom grenade hitting the mud outside their position spurred Vargas into action. Vargas, despite the chaos, grabbed the handset, attempting to punch out a contact report, the static mocking him. The 2 M26s detonated almost simultaneously, concussing the wet air and momentarily suppressing the enemy position. But the initial surprise belonged to the NBA. A furious burst of AK fire tore into the sandbags above Rooker's head, showering them with grit and jute fibers. Delaney, paralyzed for a split second by the magnitude of his mistake, was jolted back by a chunk of shrapnel grazing his cheek. Guilt transformed instantly into primal, savage adrenaline. He seized his rifle, snapped the stock open, and began laying down uncontrolled suppressive fire toward the area where the muzzle flashes momentarily appeared. The elegant dance between waiting and action had ended in a brutal, chaotic free-for-all, fought entirely in the confines of a tiny, muddy hole. The proximity of the contact meant the fight was immediate and brutal. They weren't fighting across a field. They were fighting into a thicket 20 yards away. The NVA team, clearly disciplined and aggressive, immediately advanced under the cover of their initial suppression. Rooker emptied a magazine, focusing on target acquisition, shouting instructions over the deafening report of weapons and the constant rain. Vargas, fire control, call, and the danger close. Vargas managed to get 3 garbled words. Contact, ridge 7 of 4, taking fire, before a heavy round impacted the sandbag next to his head. He gasped, dropping the radio. The handset, their link to life, was uselessly dangling in the mud. The antenna snapped. Delaney, using his guilt as fuel, was surprisingly effective, his fire steadying as he saw 2 figures fall back into the brush. But the NVA were flanking. They heard movement to their right, a sloshing sound in the waterlogged dirt, signaling a direct attempt to rush their narrow foxhole. A shadow detached itself from the gloom, rushing the bunker entrance. Rooker didn't even shoulder his weapon. He reacted purely instinctively, throwing his rifle aside and driving the point of his K-bar deep into the advancing soldier's chest. The man collapsed without a sound, his body wedging against the entrance, dripping warm blood into the cold rainwater. The flank maneuver necessitated a tactical shift. Rooker realized they couldn't hold the position. The enemy knew their precise coordinates and were now attempting to breach the limited defenses. Their dead attacker had inadvertently revealed the NVA's method. They were using a flooded, concealed drainage ditch that ran parallel to their bunker, offering perfect cover for a rapid assault. The ditch. They're running the ditch. Rooker yelled, scrambling to grab the last of their fragmentation rounds. Vargas, nursing a ringing ear and a deep shoulder bruise, provided crucial covering fire, forcing the NVA heads down while Rooker executed a desperate gambit. Rooker armed and threw his 2 remaining M67s directly into the ditch opening, timing the throws perfectly to maximize the shrapnel and collapse the saturated earth walls. The explosions were muffled by the mud, but the effect was immediate. The assault stopped, replaced by cries of pain and the sickening sound of collapsing dirt. But Rooker's action was double-edged. While it sealed the enemy's flanking attempt and bought them minutes, it also sealed their own fate in the bunker. With the radio dead, they were isolated, and the enemy knew exactly where they were digging out. "We run the line now. Go, go, go." Delaney, cover the egress. Rooker barked, pulling the dead soldier's body aside and preparing to exit the narrow, waterlogged hole. The escape was a desperate, uncontrolled slide down the slick, leech-infested slope. Stealth was impossible. They relied entirely on speed and the continued noise of their M16s to mask their retreat. The rain, momentarily their enemy, now became their meager ally, slicking the ground and confusing visibility for the pursuing NVA. Vargas, burdened by the heavy radio and his injuries, struggled to maintain footing, Rooker gripping his collar and dragging him down the steepest section. Delaney, running rear guard, sprayed fire up the hill, his mind cycling between sheer survival and the paralyzing fear of being left behind. He was haunted by the image of the dropped lighter. His distraction cost them everything. As they slid into a ravine thick with submerged roots, Delaney tripped over a submerged log. His M16 tumbled from his numb fingers, sliding 10 feet down the muddy slope. For a horrifying moment, he was weaponless, exposed, and vulnerable, the only sound the pounding rain and the incoming rounds cracking the air above his head. He scrambled, prioritizing the weapon over his own safety, lunging for the rifle, ignoring the hot sting of mud and rock tearing into his palms. He recovered the weapon, slammed a fresh magazine home, and sprinted after his team, the chaotic fight forcing them from the mental torture of waiting into the physical torment of the run. They ran for 2 kilometers before Rooker found a suitable elevated position for an emergency extraction, a narrow, rocky outcrop designated LZ Cobra. The air support arrived 10 minutes later, pulling them out through the monsoon clouds in a deafening frenzy of rotors and spray. Sitting battered and soaked in the belly of the Huey, the stench of cordite, blood, and mud overwhelming the stale smell of jet fuel, the reality of the past hour settled in. The fight, which had felt like an eternity of chaos, had lasted less than 5 minutes, preceded by 6 days of paralyzing quiet. Rooker looked at Delaney, whose face was streaked with mud and the dry blood from his cheek wound. He didn't offer a lecture, only a silent acknowledgement of the terrible duality they had just experienced. Delaney, trembling, reached into his pocket and pulled out the Zippo. It was mud-caked and dented from the fall, but its brass shell was still intact. He stared at the civilian object, the small, seemingly innocent thing that had brought the entire violent weight of the war down upon them. He realized the most terrifying truth of Vietnam. The enemy wasn't always a distant contact or a hidden trap. Sometimes, the enemy was the agonizing silence, and the trigger was merely the sound of a personal weakness exposed at the worst possible moment. He thumbed the lid open, and this time, the click of the brass was loud, echoing over the noise of the helicopter blades, a sound of bitter finality. He didn't try to light it. He just held it, the tangible echo of the chaos it unleashed.